There is a tablet behind glass in Philadelphia. It fits in the palm of a hand. The clay is cracked. Whole columns of text have eroded into silence, but what remains on this single broken surface is one of the oldest stories any human being ever chose to write down. It is the story of a goddess named Inanna, who walked willingly into the land of the dead, who was killed there and hung on a hook like something discarded, who was restored to life by the smallest act of compassion the universe could offer, and who returned to the world above carrying a debt that someone she loved would have to pay. The words were pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, over 4,000 years ago. You can still see where the scribe's hand steadied against the surface. You can still feel the intent behind each mark, the careful, deliberate weight of someone recording something that mattered. The story they recorded describes a cosmos governed by a single, quiet law. Nothing leaves the land of the dead without something taking its place. Death, in this universe, is never defeated. It is only moved. Before Inanna reached the throne room of her sister, she passed through 7 gates. At each one she was asked to give something up. By the time she reached the last, she had nothing left at all. The tablet was excavated from the ruins of Nippur, in what is now southern Iraq, during a series of American expeditions in the 1890s. The full poem runs to 412 lines. Its fragments are scattered across museums on 3 continents. Piecing them back together took more than a century, and the patience of scholars who understood that some stories are worth the wait. But a single tablet, however remarkable, holds only part of the text, and the story it preserves is still not finished. What the tablets reveal, when read together, is something more than a myth. It is a map of the oldest questions the human mind has asked, about power, death, love, and the cost of coming back. The text survives in more than 50 cuneiform fragments, now held in museums across 3 continents, in Philadelphia, London, Baghdad, Istanbul, and Berlin. Some fragments preserve merely 4 partial lines, others span nearly 200, encompassing the composition's conclusion. Together, they have been assembled into a reconstructed poem of 412 lines, a process that took generations. The first tablets were recovered during the University of Pennsylvania's excavations at Nippur, which began in 1889. Nippur, located roughly 150 kilometers south of modern Baghdad, was one of the most important religious centers of ancient Sumer, home to the Eka, the temple of the god Enlil, and a major center of scribal education, whose schools produced an enormous volume of literary tablets. The materials recovered were divided between the Pen Museum and the Ottoman Imperial Museum in Istanbul. Early progress was slow. The first partial English translation appeared in 1916. Additional fragments surfaced through the 1930s, gradually extending the readable text. But a clear picture of the narrative remained elusive for decades. The scholar whose name became most closely associated with this text was Samuel Noah Kramer, a Sumerologist at the University of Pennsylvania, who devoted decades to assembling the literary puzzle. His identification of a key tablet at Yale University in 1950 fundamentally altered understanding of the narrative. It revealed that Inanna's descent preceded Dumuzi's condemnation, overturning the earlier assumption, shaped by the Greek myth of Orpheus, that Inanna had gone to rescue her beloved. She had not gone looking for him. She had gone seeking power for herself. Further discoveries continued through the 20th century. William R. Sladek's 1974 doctoral dissertation added 7 more artifacts to the corpus. And in 2001, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at the University of Oxford published what remains the most widely referenced modern composite translation. The tradition the text records may be considerably older than the tablets themselves. The divine name, Inanna-Kur, meaning Inanna of the Netherworld, appears on proto-cuneiform tablets from the late 4th millennium BC. This may make it the oldest reliably attested mythological story in human history. The story of this reconstruction is itself a quiet narrative of persistence. Scholars in Philadelphia, London, Istanbul, and Baghdad, each contributing fragments to a picture that no single institution could complete alone. Scholarship did not end with the Oxford composite. In 1996, the Danish Sumerologist Bent Alster re-examined the text's concluding passages and reached an unexpected conclusion, that Inanna herself, having condemned Dumuzi, later interceded on his behalf to secure his seasonal return. This complicated the prevailing view of Inanna as solely wrathful and suggested a more ambiguous emotional arc. New translations followed in subsequent decades, offering fresh insights into contested passages and the stripping scene, which some scholars have reinterpreted not as humiliation but as a state of preparation, noting that depictions of the dead in Mesopotamian art frequently show them unclothed without any implication of disgrace. The scholarly conversation, more than a century after those first tentative renderings, continues to evolve. With the text assembled, the next question is the world that produced it. What kind of civilization writes a story like this, and where did it place the goddess at its centre? The civilization that produced this narrative occupied the alluvial plains of southern Mesopotamia between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is now southern Iraq. From approximately 4,500 to 1900 BC, the Sumerians developed one of the earliest complex urban civilizations on Earth. They invented cuneiform writing, initially as an accounting system for temple administration, and gradually expanded its use to encompass literature, law, mathematics, and astronomical observation. The earliest cuneiform tablets, recovered from the Inanna precinct at Uruk and dated to roughly 3,300 to 3,100 BC, are administrative documents recording allocations of beer rations and counts of livestock. They represent the earliest known form of writing, and by extension, the earliest known form of recorded human thought. The site of Uruk itself, modern Raqqa in Iraq, was the city most closely associated with the goddess at the centre of this narrative. At its peak during the 4th millennium BC, Uruk was the largest city in the world, covering approximately 5.5 square kilometres and housing an estimated 40,000 to 80,000 inhabitants. The city was divided into two sacred districts, the Anu precinct, dedicated to the sky god, and the Inanna precinct dedicated to Inanna. The Inanna, whose Sumerian name means House of Heaven, was not merely a single temple, but a sprawling complex of mud brick buildings, courtyards, workshops, and administrative offices, a place that served as both religious centre and economic engine. The earliest structures in the Inanna precinct featured walls decorated with thousands of baked clay cones, dipped in coloured glaze and pressed into wet plaster to create geometric patterns in red, black and white. This technique transformed functional mud brick walls into shimmering surfaces designed to catch and scatter sunlight. The limestone temple, possibly the earliest structure specifically identifiable as an Inanna temple, established the prototype for Mesopotamian temple architecture. Corners aligned to the cardinal directions, a central hall flanked by smaller chambers, and buttressed facades, a form that persisted for over 3 millennia. Among the most significant artefacts recovered from the Inanna precinct is the Waka vase, a carved alabaster vessel standing approximately 1 metre tall, discovered in fragments during the 1933 to 1934 excavation season. Its 4 registers of relief sculpture read from bottom to top as a cosmological statement: flowing water and vegetation at the base, then a procession of animals, then nude male figures carrying offerings, and at the summit, a robed figure presenting these gifts before a female figure flanked by the reed bundle symbols of Inanna. The composition ascends from the foundations of existence, water and plant life, through the animal world and human labour, rising to the divine encounter that gives meaning and order to everything below. The vase articulates, some 3 centuries before the earliest literary texts, the theological relationship between nature, humanity, and divinity that cuneiform literature would later express in words. Another artefact of extraordinary significance from the same site is the Mask of Waka, a carved white marble female face dated to approximately 3100 BC, probably depicting Inanna herself, and one of the earliest known realistic depictions of the human face in the history of art. Originally attached to a wooden core and fitted with inlaid eyes and eyebrows of shell and lapis lazuli, its serene expression and carefully modelled features suggest not a portrait of a specific individual, but a visualization of the divine feminine as understood by the earliest urban civilization. The mask was looted from the Iraq Museum during the chaos of April 2003 and recovered months later, buried in a farmer's backyard north of Baghdad, wrapped in a cloth and stuffed in a plastic bag, yet remarkably undamaged. The goddess, whose descent is recorded in the cuneiform tablets, was not an abstract theological concept. She was the patron deity of one of the largest and most powerful cities in the ancient world, worshipped in a temple complex of monumental proportions, honoured with some of the finest artworks the civilization produced, and served by a priestly hierarchy that administered both her cult and the economic life of the city. Who, then, was this goddess? And who was the consort whose fate became entangled with hers? Inanna, known to the Acadians and Babylonians as Ishtar, was the most prominent and most complex deity in the Sumerian pantheon. She appeared in more myths than any other Sumerian god or goddess. Her domains encompassed war, love, fertility, sensuality, political power, and divine law. She was associated with the planet Venus and worshipped in archaic Uruk in 3 distinct forms, corresponding to different aspects of that planet's appearance: morning Inanna, evening Inanna, and princely Inanna. The movements of Venus across the sky, its periodic disappearance as it passes near the sun before reappearing on the opposite horizon, are believed by scholars to form the astronomical basis for the myth of her descent and return. The planet vanishes from the evening sky, remains hidden for a time, and then reappears as the morning star. This celestial rhythm corresponds with notable precision to the mythical passage through 7 gates described in the cuneiform texts. Her most prominent symbols, the lion and the 8-pointed star, appear on cylinder seals, temple reliefs, and boundary stones spanning more than 2 millennia. She embodied a radical duality, simultaneously the bringer of abundance and the breaker of order, commander of armies and of lovers. According to the myth quote 0, she obtained the me, the sacred principles understood to make civilized existence possible, from the god of wisdom through a combination of persistence and cunning, transporting them from Eridu to her own city of Uruk. One scholarly reading suggests this mythological transfer may reflect a historical shift in cultural dominance between the 2 cities. In another myth, quote 1, a young Inanna discovers a tree growing on the banks of the Euphrates and transplants it to her garden in Uruk, intending to fashion a throne and a bed from its wood. But the tree becomes infested. A serpent nests in its roots, the Anzu bird builds in its crown, and the demoness Lilitu takes up residence in its trunk. It is Gilgamesh who answers her call for help, felling the tree and driving off its creatures. From its wood, Inanna receives her throne and bed, while Gilgamesh fashions for himself 2 mysterious objects, the Elag and the Echidna. This myth connects Inanna directly to the Gilgamesh cycle, and through it, to the broader network of Sumerian underworld narratives. Her consort was Dumuzi, known to the Acadians as Tammuz, a deity associated with agriculture, shepherding, and fertility. His full Sumerian name, Dumuzi-Tsipad, quote 2, reflects his role as the provider of pastoral abundance. The Sumerian king list records a figure named Dumuzid in 2 entries, once as an antediluvian king with a reign of 36,000 years, and again in a later dynasty at Uruk, 2 rulers before Gilgamesh. Whether these represent the same figure or distinct traditions remains uncertain, but the shared name and divine associations suggest a deep mythological connection, one that blurs the boundary between god and historical king in ways characteristic of Sumerian thought. Ancient Near Eastern peoples associated Dumuzi with the abundance of spring. During the hot, dry summers of Mesopotamia, when vegetation withered, it was believed Dumuzi had descended to the Underworld. Communities across the region engaged in public ritual mourning during the month named after him. The lamentation literature that accompanied these rites constitutes one of the most substantial bodies of religious poetry from the ancient world. The Emsal laments for Dumuzi, performed by Gala priests who sang in a feminine vocal register, are among the most emotionally direct compositions in Sumerian literature. Their imagery of empty sheepfolds, dried-up pastures, and silenced reed pipes conveys a sense of desolation that transcends its specific cultural context. And beside Inanna stood a figure whose role in the myth would prove decisive at its most critical moment, Ninshubur. Though often described simply as Inanna's servant, Ninshubur occupied a far more significant position. Her Sumerian name has been translated as Lady of Subatu, suggesting origins or associations with the northern frontier. She was the subject of independent worship in multiple Sumerian cities, and several kings of the Lagash dynasty regarded her as their personal protective deity. The Sumerian literary tradition preserved her as a figure of absolute loyalty, a companion whose faithfulness in crisis would determine whether Inanna survived or perished. With these figures now familiar, the narrative itself can begin. It opens with an act of quiet, extraordinary resolve, and it moves toward a law that governs everything that follows. In this universe, nothing leaves the land of the dead without something taking its place. The poem begins with lines that possess the cadence and gravity of an incantation. From the great heaven she set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven the goddess set her mind on the great below. From the great heaven Inanna set her mind on the great below. My mistress abandoned heaven, abandoned earth, and descended to the underworld. The repetition is deliberate. Each iteration narrows the focus. First a general statement, then the identification of the deity, then her specific name, then the scope of what was relinquished. Heaven, earth, and the underworld constituted the three-part structure of Sumerian cosmology. To abandon the first two and descend into the third was to leave the entirety of the known universe for its negation. The text then enumerates the specific temples Inanna abandons: the Iana in Uruk, the Amushkalama in Bad Tibira, the Jiguna in Zabalam, the Akara in Adab, the Baradurgara in Nippur, the Hursa Kalama in Kish, the Ulmash in Akkad, and in some manuscripts temples in Umma, Ur, Girsu, Isin, and beyond. This litany of abandoned sanctuaries accomplishes something more than geographical enumeration. It establishes the magnitude of what Inanna is surrendering. Not a single city or domain, but the entire sacred infrastructure of her worship across the Sumerian world. To leave them all is to leave civilization itself behind. Inanna's stated reason was to attend the funeral rites of Gugalana, the Bull of Heaven, husband of Ereshkigal, Queen of the Dead and Inanna's elder sister. But scholars have debated whether this was her true motivation. The text gives no indication of particular grief. The prevailing interpretation holds that her true purpose was to extend her dominion into the one realm she did not yet control. This was not a rescue mission. It was an act of cosmic ambition. Her preparations, her careful instructions to Ninshuber, her gathering of the 7 Mi, indicate not impulsive recklessness, but deliberate planning. Inanna orchestrated her own death, provoked the intervention of the gods, and engineered her resurrection. By this reading, her endeavour was a calculated success. Before descending, she adorned herself with 7 articles of divine power, each a Mi embodying a specific aspect of her authority: the Shugura headpiece of rulership, a wig, small lapis lazuli beads for her neck, twin egg-shaped beads for her breast, the pala dress of ladyship, kohl for her eyes, and a lapis lazuli measuring rod and line, instruments of justice and cosmic order. She also gave precise instructions to Ninshubur. If she did not return within 3 days, Ninshubur was to set up a public lament and appeal, sequentially to the gods Enlil, Nanna, and Enki. She descended into the realm of death not blindly, but with a contingency plan. When Ereshkigal learned of her sister's arrival at the outer gate, the text records a reaction of quiet alarm. Quote 1. This is not the response of a ruler greeting a welcome guest. It is the response of a woman confronted by a rival whose power had always overshadowed her own, whose arrival could only mean an attempt to seize what little sovereignty Ereshkigal possessed. Here, already, the tension between the two sisters begins to exert its gravity on the narrative. Ereshkigal's response was strategic. She ordered the gatekeeper Neti to bolt the 7 gates and to admit Inanna one at a time, requiring the removal of 1 article of divine regalia at each threshold. The progressive stripping was not a general funerary custom, but a deliberate strategy to neutralize Inanna, removing the very powers that defined her identity. At each gate, when Inanna protested, the gatekeeper responded with a formula carrying the weight of cosmic law. Be satisfied, Inanna. A divine power of the underworld has been fulfilled. Inanna, you must not open your mouth against the rights of the underworld. The repetition of this phrase at each of the 7 gates creates a literary effect of quiet, mechanical inevitability. The laws of the underworld operate without exception and without appeal. They apply to the lowest human and to the highest god with equal force. The specific items removed correspond to distinct domains of power and identity. Lapis lazuli, imported from mines in what is now northeastern Afghanistan through trade networks spanning thousands of kilometres, was among the most valued materials in the ancient Near East, a material embodiment of the economic and diplomatic reach that underpinned Sumerian civilization. The measuring rod and line were instruments of territorial sovereignty. The pale dress signified institutional authority. Together, these items did not merely adorn Inanna. They constituted her in the same way that the Mi they embodied constituted civilization itself. To remove them was to deconstruct the goddess layer by layer. The number 7 carried cosmological significance in Sumerian thought, appearing in temple architecture, astronomical observation, mythological geography and ritual practice. The 7 gates may represent not merely a narrative structure but a cosmological map, each corresponding to a phase of Venus's disappearance from the evening sky. By the time Inanna passed through the 7th gate, she was described simply as, quote, 3. She entered Ereshkigal's throne room and attempted to sit upon her sister's throne, a final gesture that confirmed the depth of her vulnerability. The 7 judges of the Underworld, the Anunnaki, rendered their verdict. Quote 4, Ereshkigal killed Inanna, and her corpse was hung on a hook on the wall, where it turned, as the text states, into a piece of rotting meat. Death, in the Sumerian understanding, was not a peaceful transition. The Underworld was a place of dust, darkness, and silence, where the dead existed as diminished shades consuming clay and drinking dirty water. There was no paradise for the virtuous, no special punishment for the wicked. Death reduced everyone, mortal and divine, to the same condition. Ereshkigal herself deserves careful attention. She's not a villain. She's a queen confined to a realm of misery, recently bereaved, confronted by a sister who possesses everything she's been denied. One scholarly reading suggests the relationship between the two sisters represents an early exploration of complementary aspects of a single cosmic principle. Inanna embodying what is bright and externally powerful, Ereshkigal embodying what is dark and internally consuming. Their encounter becomes a collision between 2 dimensions of existence that require each other for the universe to function. 3 days passed. On the surface, Ninshubur executed her instructions. Enlil refused to help. Nana refused. Only Enki, the god of wisdom, responded. His approach was indirect and inventive. He created 2 small beings from the dirt beneath his fingernails, the Galatura and the Kurgara, as sexual figures existing outside the binary categories of gender. Being neither one thing nor the other, they could slip through the boundaries separating the living from the dead. Enki gave them the food of the life and the water of life and sent them into the underworld with a single instruction: find Ereshkigal and mirror her suffering. They entered the Netherworld, quote 5. When they found Ereshkigal, she was in agony, suffering what many translators describe as labour pains. The detail, if taken as birth pangs in the realm of death, may suggest that the underworld is not merely a repository of the dead, but something generative, a womb from which renewal emerges, just as seeds must be buried before they germinate, and grain must be cut before it is planted again. What the Galatura and the Kurgara did represents one of the most quietly profound moments in the surviving literature of the ancient world. They did not fight Ereshkigal, they did not trick her. They sat with her in her pain and expressed compassion. When she moaned, they moaned. When she cried out, they cried out. They offered the simplest and most powerful form of human connection: empathetic presence, the willingness to witness suffering without attempting to fix, minimize, or escape from it. Ereshkigal was so moved that she offered them any gift they desired. They asked for the corpse on the hook. She granted the request. They sprinkled Inanna's body with the food of life and the water of life, and she rose. The mechanism deserves reflection. Enki did not create warriors to fight death. He created mourners, beings whose sole function was to witness suffering and respond with fellow feeling. The food and water of life were necessary but not sufficient. The emotional precondition, genuine compassion, was the essential catalyst. The text tells us that what defeats death is not power or cunning, but empathy. The capacity to share in suffering possesses a force that even the authority of the underworld cannot resist. But resurrection in this story is not freedom. The underworld operates on an inviolable law. No one may ascend without providing a substitute. The universe functions on a principle of strict equilibrium. Every departure must be balanced by a corresponding arrival. The Gala demons, enforcers of this cosmic law, accompanied Inanna as she ascended through the 7 gates, restoring her articles of power at each threshold. But they walked beside her with the patience of creditors. The Gala were not evil in the mortal sense. They served a cosmic function, maintaining the balance between the worlds of the living and the dead. They knew no food and no drink, accepted no offerings and no prayers, and could not be appeased. They were the mechanism by which the underworld enforced its absolute authority. What entered must remain, or something of equal value must take its place. Their implacability made them not villains, but instruments of natural law, as indifferent and as essential as gravity. As Inanna travelled through the cities of Sumer, she encountered her servants dressed in mourning, prostrate with grief. When the demons moved to seize Nippur, Inanna refused. When they approached her sons, Shara and Lulal, she refused again. Each encounter demonstrated her capacity for gratitude and mercy. The text describes Nippur throwing herself in the dust at Inanna's feet, and Inanna's defence of her is passionate. She recalls how Nippur set up the lament, beat the drum, circled the houses of the gods, tore at her eyes, her mouth, her thighs, and dressed in a single garment like a beggar. This is not an abstract offence. It is the recognition of a debt that outweighs the law of the underworld. Shara is protected because he sings hymns to me, who cuts my nails and smooths my hair. Intimate details of a relationship grounded in daily tenderness. Lulal is protected because he demonstrated the proper grief. The text establishes a clear moral calculus. Those who mourned Inanna's absence, who honoured her memory in her death, are shielded. Those who did not mourn forfeit that protection. Then she arrived in Uruk and found Dumuzi. He was sitting on her throne. He was dressed in splendid garments. He was not mourning. The text does not elaborate on his motivations. It records Inanna's response. She fixed her eye upon him. It was the eye of death. She spoke against him. It was the word of wrath. She cried out against him. It was the cry of guilt. She handed him to the demons. The same formula applied to Inanna by the Anunnaki judges was now applied by her to her own husband. The text offers no explicit moral judgment. It does not condemn Inanna for cruelty or praise her for justice. It presents the scene with the directness of a court record, allowing the audience to draw its own conclusions. One reading proposes that in Sumerian mourning customs, where public expressions of grief were obligatory and religiously meaningful, Dumuzi's failure represented a fundamental violation of relational bonds. Another suggests his behaviour may reflect a political reality, the exercise of authority in the queen's absence, which Inanna experienced as usurpation. The text preserves the ambiguity without resolving it. Dumuzi prayed to the sun god Utu for help. Utu transformed his hands and feet into those of a snake, allowing him to flee. But the escape was temporary. The Gala demons pursued him. In the parallel composition, Dumuzi's Dream, Dumuzi has prophetic nightmares foreshadowing his capture. His sister Geshtinana attempted to hide him, but he was ultimately found and taken. One tradition suggests that after Dumuzi temporarily evaded the demons, Inanna herself grieved for her condemned husband and searched for his body. If this reading is correct, it complicates the portrait of Inanna as solely vengeful, suggesting instead a figure who condemned and mourned simultaneously. Geshtinana, goddess of agriculture and dream interpretation, then volunteered to take her brother's place. Her name, quote 4, connects her to the agricultural symbolism of the entire myth cycle. Her willingness to share his fate represents a form of love distinct from Inanna's passionate attachment, or Ninshubur's faithful service, the bond of shared origin. Her agreement to alternate with Dumuzi, spending half the year in darkness so he might spend half in light, transforms the law of substitution from an instrument of punishment into a framework for shared sacrifice. Inanna, moved by this offer, decreed the arrangement that would define the cosmic order. Dumuzi and Geshtinana would each spend half the year in the underworld, alternating with each other. The decree carries the weight of constitutional legislation, a permanent rearrangement of the cosmos. And with that decree, the myth becomes something else entirely, an explanation for the turning of the seasons, for why the land greens and withers, and for the rhythms that govern the lives of everyone who heard the story told. And the cost of return would soon become clear, not only in the world of the living, but in the geography of death itself. To understand the gravity of Inanna's descent, it helps to understand the place she descended into. The Sumerian underworld was not a metaphor. It was a location within a carefully articulated cosmic geography, as real and as tangible to its believers as the cities they inhabited. The Sumerians envisioned the universe as a closed dome surrounded by a primordial saltwater sea. Beneath the terrestrial earth lay a freshwater ocean called the Abzu, the domain of the god Enki, source of rivers, springs, and all fertility. Below even the Abzu lay the underworld, the deepest and most remote layer of the cosmos. The Sumerians applied many names to this realm. Kur, the most ancient, was written with the cuneiform pictograph for _0_, reflecting perhaps the earliest conception of the land of the dead as located beyond or beneath the mountains on the horizon. Kigal meant, one Irkala stressed its status as a domain unto itself. Kuku meant simply, two. The multiplicity of names suggests that conceptions of the underworld evolved over centuries, accumulating layers of meaning as different communities and periods contributed their understanding. Physically, the underworld was imagined as a vast subterranean city, complete with a palace for its queen, walls, gates, and residential areas for the dead. Entry required crossing the Huber, a river that could not be recrossed, its waters flowing in one direction only. Whether this was understood as a literal underground river or a metaphorical boundary remains debated, but its function was clear. It separated the living from the dead as absolutely as death itself. The entrance was believed to lie in the Zagros Mountains to the east, a geographical association that may reflect the Sumerian experience of the mountains as a frontier beyond which the familiar world ended and the unknown began. The 7 gates through which Inanna passed were guarded by the gatekeeper Neti, whose duty was to enforce the protocols of entry. Life within the underworld was described in terms of radical deprivation. The dead ate dry dust and drank dirty water. No sunlight penetrated its depths, save briefly during the nightly passage of the sun god Utu, who was believed to travel through the underworld on his journey from west to east in preparation for the next day's sunrise. The dead were sometimes described as naked, sometimes as clothed in feathers like birds, their forms diminished, their identities reduced to shadows of their former selves. No moral judgment awaited the dead, unlike the later Egyptian conception, with its weighing of the heart, or the Christian division into heaven and hell. The Sumerian afterlife made no distinction between the virtuous and the wicked. All arrived at the same destination. A person's quality of existence depended not on moral conduct, but on the manner of burial, and the continuing devotion of living descendants. Those given proper burial with appropriate grave goods fared better. Those whose descendants continued to pour libations, offerings of water and food transmitted through clay pipes into the grave, sustained a tolerable existence. Those who died without descendants, without proper burial, without anyone to remember them, suffered most acutely. They received nothing at all. This belief system created a powerful incentive for social reproduction. To have many children was not merely a biological imperative, but a religious one. To die childless was a fate as terrible as death itself, for it meant an eternity of thirst. The ruler of this realm requires closer examination, for Ereshkigal is among the most complex and most neglected figures in Mesopotamian mythology. Her name, quote 3, establishes her authority over the vastest domain in the Sumerian cosmos. Yet her cult was remarkably limited. No personal names bearing _4_ as a theophoric element have been identified in the surviving record. Mesopotamian parents regularly named children after the gods they venerated. That no parent chose Ereshkigal's name suggests a reluctance so deep it extended even to the act of naming. Her origin myth describes her as having been carried off to the underworld, possibly as a form of forced assignment when the cosmos was divided among the great gods. If this reading is accepted, her sovereignty over the dead was not chosen but imposed. She's not merely the queen who kills her sister. She's a woman trapped in a kingdom of dust, confronted by a sister who possesses everything the cosmos denied her. Sunlight, love, beauty, freedom, and power above the earth. The beliefs surrounding Ereshkigal evolved across centuries. In later periods, the myth of Nergal and Ereshkigal describes how Ereshkigal acquired a consort, in one version through force, in another through love. Their marriage may represent less a romantic union than a theological compromise, an administrative merger of competing regional traditions of underworld rulership. It was into this realm, this vast city of dust and silence and perpetual shadow, governed by this formidable and sorrowful queen, that Inanna chose to descend. And it was from this realm that no one had ever returned without leaving something behind. When Dumuzi was present in the world of the living, the land was fertile. The rains fell, the barley grew, the flocks multiplied. When he descended to the underworld, the land dried under the Mesopotamian sun. The rivers contracted, the fields cracked. Life itself seemed to withdraw from the surface of the earth. The historian Jean Bottereau identified an additional layer of agricultural symbolism. Dumuzi, in certain traditions, was depicted as a barley grain used to produce beer. Gesht Inanna was associated with the grapevine from which wine was made. Beer, the staple drink of Mesopotamian civilization, was brewed during the cool months when Dumuzi occupied the surface. Wine production followed the complementary schedule dictated by the grape harvest. The myth encoded not merely a general understanding of seasonal change but specific knowledge of agricultural timing. The connection between Dumuzi and grain extended to the visual arts. Cylinder seal impressions from the 3rd millennium depict a figure identified as Dumuzi merging with stalks of grain, his body dissolving into vegetal forms. The Waka vase, with its bottom register of grain and flowing water ascending to the divine encounter at its summit, may be read as a visual expression of this same theology. Dumuzi and his companion Ningish-Zida, another chthonic deity, were said in certain traditions to stand as gatekeepers of heaven, their dual existence spanning both the underworld and the celestial realm. They embodied the idea that existence itself was cyclical, that what descended would rise, that what died would return in altered form. These patterns were not merely told, they were enacted, physically and ceremonially, through rituals that persisted across Mesopotamia for millennia. During the month of Dumuzi in midsummer, communities performed public lamentation ceremonies marking his descent. The Gala priests sang elaborate dirges in the Emsal dialect. These laments survive in cuneiform copies and constitute one of the largest categories of Sumerian religious literature. In autumn, communities celebrated Dumuzi's return. These celebrations were incorporated into the Akitu festival, the Sumerian and later Babylonian New Year ceremony, and the most important religious observance in the Mesopotamian calendar. The Akitu lasted 12 days and incorporated processions, recitations of creation myths, and ritual combats representing the triumph of order over chaos. One of its most remarkable sequences involved the ritual humiliation of the king, who was stripped of his regalia and struck by a priest before being restored to his throne, a ceremony that scholars have interpreted as a symbolic death and resurrection, paralleling the mythic cycle of Dumuzi. The king wept before the god statue to demonstrate his humility. Then his insignia were returned, and his reign was symbolically renewed. Archaeological evidence for the Akitu festival spans from the Ur-3 period through the Seleucid era, a continuity of nearly 2,000 years. The sacred marriage was arguably the most significant ritual expression of the myth cycle. This ceremony appears to have taken place during the Akitu festival, and involved the symbolic, and possibly physical, as union of the king, representing Dumuzi, and a high priestess, representing Inanna. The sequence moved through multiple stages. Inanna was bathed, perfumed, and adorned. The king processed to her shrine. Temple personnel sang love songs. The consummation was followed by a banquet and formal enthronement. Through this act, the mortal king became the avatar of the god. In return, Inanna blessed his reign with fertility and prosperity. Whether the ceremony was physically enacted or purely symbolic remains debated. What is clear is that the concept of sacred union between divine and mortal occupied a central place in Sumerian thought. A substantial corpus of love poetry survives from this ritual context, notable for both its emotional tenderness and its sensuality. These poems, composed in the voices of Inanna and Dumuzi, rank among the finest lyric poetry of any ancient civilization. Parallels have been drawn between these poems and the Song of Songs in the Hebrew Bible, a connection that remains debated but continues to attract scholarly attention. The city of excavated by Sir Leonard Woolley between 1922 and 1934, yielded rich evidence for ritual life. The Great Ziggurat and surrounding Tamino's complex revealed processional ways, courtyards capable of holding hundreds of participants, and preparation rooms for ritual performers. Terracotta plaques depicting mourning figures suggest that participation extended far beyond the professional priesthood. The lyres recovered from the royal cemetery of including the famous bull-headed lyre, demonstrate the centrality of music to these practices. The myth was not confined to tablets in scribal schools. It permeated the entire fabric of communal life. But to understand why the text survived in the specific form it did, we need to look more closely at the institutions that preserved it. The tablets that preserve Inanna's descent to the Netherworld were products of the Edubar, the Sumerian scribal school, an institution that served as academy, archive, and cultural transmission mechanism for more than a millennium. The scribal schools of the Earthly and Old Babylonian periods operated primarily within temple complexes. Young men, and in rare cases young women, entered the Edubar as children and trained for years in the increasingly complex art of cuneiform writing. A Sumerian literary text known as School Days describes the daily routine frankly. A student arrives, recites his tablet, eats his lunch, prepares a new tablet, is given a writing assignment, and is supervised, and frequently punished, by a series of school officials. The curriculum was standardized. Beginning students copied simple sign lists. Intermediate students progressed to proverbs and dialogues. Advanced students copied the major works of Sumerian literature, myths, hymns, royal praise poems, and laments. Inanna's Descent belonged to this advanced curriculum. Its presence in multiple copies from multiple cities confirms that it was one of the works every properly educated scribe was expected to know. A remarkable feature of the Eduba curriculum was that Sumerian, by the Old Babylonian period, was no longer a spoken language. It had been supplanted by Acadian as the language of daily communication. Yet the scribal schools continued to teach Sumerian as a literary and liturgical language, much as medieval European universities taught Latin long after it had ceased to be anyone's mother tongue. The students who copied this text were working in a learned language, translating and interpreting as they copied, engaged in an act of cultural preservation that required not merely manual skill, but literary competence. The scribal schools did not merely copy texts, they edited them. Variant readings across different tablet copies reveal a tradition in which scribes exercised editorial discretion, adding glosses, omitting obscure passages, substituting more familiar terms, occasionally expanding or condensing sections. The 50-plus fragments that comprise the composite text do not all agree. The 412-line count is itself a modern construct, assembled from overlapping fragments with editorial decisions required at every point of divergence. Clay tablets were prepared by kneading river clay into flat rectangular forms and impressing the text while the clay was still damp. A tablet had to be completed before the clay dried, which imposed practical limits on length. Longer compositions were divided across multiple tablets. Colophons, brief concluding notes, sometimes recorded the scribe's name and the date. These reveal that the tablets were treated with seriousness. They were not casual exercises. They were curriculum, theology, and institutional memory preserved in a form designed to endure. The relationship between oral tradition and written text is difficult to determine for this composition. The extensive use of repetition, formulaic phrases, and mnemonic structures suggest roots in oral performance, but the written versions show evidence of literary craftsmanship that suggests the work of scribes who were composers as well as copyists. The truth likely lies somewhere between pure oral transcription and pure literary creation, a text rooted in oral tradition but shaped through generations of scribal engagement. No first millennium copies of Inanna's Descent have been found. The text appears to have fallen out of the active scribal curriculum after the Old Babylonian period, replaced by the shorter Acadian Descent of Ishtar. What survives represents a snapshot of the text at a particular moment in its long life, a moment when the scribal schools of southern Mesopotamia were still transmitting the literary heritage of a civilization already ancient. But the story did not disappear. It was transformed. The Sumerian myth of Inanna's descent did not vanish when the civilization that produced it was absorbed by Akkadian-speaking cultures. It was reshaped. The Acadian version, known as "0", is significantly shorter, roughly one-third the length of the Sumerian original. It survives primarily in tablets from the first millennium BC, though its linguistic features suggest a composition reaching back to approximately 1600 BC. The two versions are not translations of each other. They are distinct renditions of a shared tradition, each reflecting the priorities of its cultural context. The Acadian version preserves the core structure, the descent through 7 gates, the stripping of garments and power, death at the hands of Ereshkigal, resurrection through divine intervention, but omits much of the detail that gives the Sumerian text its emotional and narrative depth. Several differences are notable. The Sumerian text devotes dozens of lines to Inanna's preparations and her specific instructions to Nippur. The Acadian version compresses this severely. The catalogue of abandoned temples, the careful specification of which gods to petition, all are reduced or absent. The characterization of the goddess differs as well. Inanna, in the Sumerian text is a figure of considerable psychological complexity, ambitious, strategic, capable of both wrath and gratitude. Ishtar, in the Acadian version, is portrayed more narrowly as a figure of commanding authority. Her speech at the gates is notably more aggressive, threatening to smash the doors and raise the dead to devour the living, language absent from the Sumerian text, reflecting a different sensibility shaped by empires focused on domination and the projection of power. The Acadian version introduces a distinctive element. When Ishtar is absent from the world above, all sexual activity and reproduction ceases. This cosmic consequence makes explicit what the Sumerian version leaves implicit, that the goddess's power is structural, that her removal threatens the continuation of all life. It also shifts the theological emphasis. In the Sumerian version, Inanna is rescued because Enki is wise and Ninshuba is faithful. In the Acadian version, Ishtar must be rescued because the universe itself cannot function without her. The method of rescue also differs. Where the Galatura and Kudgara succeed through empathy, the Acadian equivalent, a beautiful being called a Sushunamir, appears to succeed through charm and distraction. What the Sumerian version presents as a meditation on compassion, the Acadian streamlines into narrative of divine intervention. The most significant structural difference concerns the ending. The Sumerian text devotes substantial attention to the aftermath of Inanna's return. The encounters with Ninshuba, Shara and Lulal, the condemnation of Dumuzi, his flight and pursuit, Geshti Nana's sacrifice, and the final cosmic decree. The Acadian version compresses or omits most of this material. Its focus remains on Ishtar's descent and resurrection, rather than on the consequences that follow. This compression shifted the myth's emphasis. The Sumerian version is, at its core, a story about consequences. The cost of ambition, the debt of resurrection, the redistribution of death. The Acadian version is more narrowly a story about power, Ishtar's power to challenge the underworld, the threat her absence poses, the necessity of her return. What the Sumerian explores through psychological nuance, the Acadian addresses through divine assertion and cosmic necessity. The relationship between the two versions illuminates how stories change as they move between languages, between cultures, and between centuries, preserving core structures while adapting to serve the needs of new audiences. To understand this text more fully, it helps to see it alongside the other great underworld narrative of the Sumerian tradition. The myth of Inanna's descent did not exist in isolation. It belonged to a network of texts concerned with the underworld, mortality, and the boundaries between the living and the dead. The most significant companion text is, quote, Zero, a Sumerian poem that predates the standard Acadian epic of Gilgamesh and was later incorporated somewhat awkwardly as its Tablet 12. The poem's opening lines, "In those days, in those distant days, in those nights, in those remote nights," establish the cosmological framework shared with Inanna's descent, the tripartite division of the cosmos among the gods, within receiving the heavens, Enlil the earth, and Ereshkigal the underworld. The poem connects directly to the Inanna cycle through the episode of the Halub tree. When Gilgamesh helps Inanna by felling the tree and driving away its inhabitants, he fashions the Elag and Echidna, but these objects fall into the Netherworld, and when Enkidu descends to retrieve them, he violates the taboos Gilgamesh has warned him about and is trapped. The underworld recognizes him as a living intruder and seizes him. The dialogue that follows constitutes one of the earliest and most detailed literary descriptions of the Mesopotamian afterlife. Gilgamesh asks about the fate of the dead, those with many sons, those with none, those killed in battle, those who received no burial. The answers form a grim catalogue. The man with 7 sons sits on a throne. The man with 1 son weeps at the base of a wall. The man with no sons eats scraps tossed in the street. The stillborn child, paradoxically, enjoys the most pleasant existence of all. The man burned to death has no existence whatsoever. His smoke went to the sky, and his spirit does not reside in the underworld. This vision is entirely consistent with the underworld portrayed in Inanna's descent. The texts reinforce each other, building a composite picture of a universe in which death is not transcended but endured, where the quality of one's afterlife depends not on moral merit but on social connection and ritual maintenance by the living. The cremation detail is especially haunting. It implies that fire did not merely destroy the body, it annihilated the soul entirely. The spirit could not reach the underworld because the physical remains that anchored it to existence had been dispersed. This belief explains the overwhelming emphasis on burial in Mesopotamian funerary practice. The Sumerian poem was later translated almost word for word into Acadian and appended to the Epic of Gilgamesh as Tablet 12. But the join is conspicuously awkward. Enkidu is alive in it, despite having died earlier in the epic. The scribes were willing to tolerate narrative inconsistency in order to preserve the completeness of their underworld testimony. Some truths, it seems, were too important to omit, even when they didn't fit. The myth of Inanna's descent exists in two major versions. The Sumerian text runs to 412 lines in its reconstructed form. The Acadian version is roughly one-third the length. The Acadian was discovered first, in the 1860s. The existence of the longer Sumerian original required approximately 50 years of collaborative work to establish. An alternative tradition further complicates the picture. Quote 0 presents a version in which Dumuzi is killed not through Inanna's condemnation but by bandits and demons, with Inanna bitterly mourning his loss rather than causing it. Both versions coexisted in Sumerian literary culture. This multiplicity suggests a fluid understanding in which multiple versions of a narrative could coexist without contradiction, because the purpose of myth was not to establish a fixed historical record, but to explore the emotional and theological dimensions of fundamental experience. The classification of Dumuzi as a dying and rising god has been one of the most persistent debates in comparative religion. Sir James George Fraser popularised the concept in The Golden Bough, arguing that at the core of religion lay a recurring pattern. A divine figure embodying fertility is annually killed and resurrected. He identified this pattern in Tammuz, Adonis, Attis, and Osiris. The discovery of the full Sumerian text appeared to undermine this thesis. The narrative ended not with resurrection but with condemnation. However, the later discovery and translation of The Return of Dumuzi revealed that Dumuzi did eventually return, splitting his time between the worlds. The scholarly position shifted multiple times over the decades. Before 1950, Dumuzi might be freed. Between 1950 and 1965, he was considered solely a dying god. After 1966, scholars were willing to speak again of death and resurrection, albeit in a qualified sense. The opposing view holds that Dumuzi's alternation does not constitute quote 5 in any meaningful sense, just as no scholar describes Persephone as a dying and rising goddess. The underworld's power remains undefeated. What occurs is a negotiated compromise, not a victory over death. The distinction may ultimately be a question of interpretation rather than proof. The texts are fragmentary, contain competing traditions, and remain open to multiple readings. What cannot be disputed is that the cycle expresses a deep human intuition about the cyclical nature of existence, one that resonated across cultures and centuries with a persistence suggesting it touches something fundamental. That persistence is itself a story. The tradition that began in Sumerian cuneiform travelled through languages, cultures and millennia, leaving traces from Babylon to Jerusalem to Athens to the modern world. The most direct line of transmission ran through the Acadian and Babylonian cultures that absorbed Sumerian civilization. Inanna became Ishtar, Dumuzi became Tammuz. Tammuz appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero rejects Ishtar's romantic advances by citing the fates of her previous lovers, with Tammuz heading the list. The allusion required no elaboration. Every listener understood. During the Assyrian Empire, Ishtar's status was further elevated. The Assyrians ranked her above their own national god in certain contexts, and her martial aspect was emphasized alongside her associations with love and fertility. Neo-Assyrian copies of The Descent of Ishtar were recovered from the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, the great royal collection of the 7th century BC that preserved much of Mesopotamian literary heritage. The Descent of Ishtar tablets from this collection were among the earliest cuneiform literary texts to be deciphered and translated, decades before the Sumerian original was recognized. The Ishtar Gate of Babylon, constructed around 575 BC, adorned with glazed brick reliefs of lions, bulls and dragons in brilliant blue, yellow and white, stood as one of the most monumental architectural expressions of her continuing power. The gate survives partially reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, its glazed brick still displaying vivid blues that recall the lapis lazuli associated with the goddess from the earliest Sumerian period. The Hebrew Bible contains direct references. Ezekiel describes women weeping for Tammuz at the north gate of the temple in Jerusalem, indicating the cult had reached Israelite practice by the 6th century BC. Jeremiah references worship of the Queen of Heaven, almost certainly a syncretism of Ishtar with the West Semitic goddess Astarte. The Song of Songs bears affinities with the Sumerian sacred marriage poetry. The Hebrew Sheol and the Acadian Akala share striking similarities. Both are subterranean, monochromatic, dusty realms where the deceased endure a diminished existence, suggesting a line of influence from Mesopotamian to Israelite conceptions of the afterlife. In the Greek world, the tradition produced the figure of Adonis, whose name derives from the Canaanite word Adon, Lord. The myth of Aphrodite and Adonis closely parallels the Inanna-Dumuzi cycle. A beautiful young deity, beloved by the goddess of love, is killed and must spend part of the year in the underworld. The festivals of Adonia involved mourning followed by celebrations of renewal. Women planted gardens of Adonis, fast-growing plants in shallow containers that sprouted quickly and withered just as fast, symbolizing the brevity of the god's life. The Greek myth of Persephone and Demeter constitutes perhaps the most direct structural parallel. Persephone is taken to the underworld. Demeter grieves so profoundly that the earth becomes barren. A compromise is reached. Persephone will spend part of the year below and part above. The seasons turn on the rhythm of her alternation. The parallels with the Inanna-Dumuzi cycle are striking, yet the differences are equally instructive. Persephone does not choose to descend. She is abducted. Her mother is the primary agent of resistance. Inanna, by contrast, descends entirely of her own volition, prepares for it, and engineers her own rescue. The agency belongs to the descending figure, not to a grieving relative left behind. This difference may reflect deeper cultural distinctions between Sumerian and Greek attitudes toward feminine power and divine initiative. In the Sumerian tradition, the goddess acts. In the Greek, she's acted upon. The Phrygian myth of Attis and Cybele, the Egyptian cycle of Osiris and Isis, each mirrors elements of the pattern. Whether these parallels reflect direct cultural transmission, shared inheritance, or independent development remains investigated. The transmission routes are plausible. Mesopotamian, Egyptian, Anatolian, and Aegean civilizations maintained trade and diplomatic contacts throughout the Bronze Age. The Amarna letters demonstrate that the literary language of Mesopotamia served as the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East, providing a mechanism through which mythological traditions could travel alongside administrative correspondence. In English literature, Milton's Paradise Lost features Tammuz among the fallen angels. T.S. Eliot acknowledged Fraser's, quote, 7 as a direct influence on, quote, 8. The archetype influenced C.S. Lewis's conversion to Christianity, catalysed by a conversation with Tolkien in 1931 at Magdalen College, Oxford, in which Tolkien argued that the pattern of death and resurrection in pagan myths was not a refutation of Christian truth, but a preparation for it. In Jungian psychology, the narrative has been proposed as a template for psychological transformation. The thread of this tradition has never been fully severed. Inanna has also become an important figure in modern feminist scholarship. Her independence, her sexual agency, and her refusal to accept limitations on her power have made her an object of sustained attention. The mythological cycle in which she is neither rescued by a male hero nor dependent on male authority offers a narrative framework strikingly different from the passive feminine roles common in later traditions. The worship of Inanna/Ishtar continued in various forms for over 3 millennia, finally declining as Christianity spread through the regions where she had once been venerated. Her temples were converted or abandoned, her cult statues destroyed or buried. But the mythological structures she embodied, the descent and return, the seasonal alternation, the divine feminine, the transformative encounter with death, survived in the traditions that succeeded her worship, carrying forward, in altered form, the inheritance of Sumer. And the physical tablets that preserve this tradition continue to yield new insights, even now. The cuneiform tablets that preserve the Inanna-Dumuzi cycle continue to be studied. Digital technology now enables scholars to identify joins between fragments in different museums, to read damaged passages using multispectral imaging, and to collaborate through resources like the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative. Approximately 60% of the tablet series associated with the broader cycle remains inadequately published, residing in museum collections awaiting analysis. Future research directions include systematic re-examination of excavation records using modern methods, completion of translation projects, and the application of advanced imaging techniques to fragments too damaged for conventional reading. Recent developments in computational cuneiform analysis, including machine learning models trained to recognize partially eroded sign forms, offer the possibility of recovering text from fragments previously considered illegible, reflectance, transformation. Imaging has revealed previously unread signs on damaged tablets by photographing them under multiple light angles and computationally combining the results. Each recovered line has the potential to alter understanding of a narrative whose interpretation has already shifted multiple times over a century. The broader intellectual legacy extends beyond philology. Philosophers of religion have found in this text one of the earliest sustained meditations on the relationship between power and mortality. Ethicists have noted its exploration of substitutionary sacrifice, whether it is just for one being's survival to require another's death. Literary scholars have recognized it as the prototype of the descent narrative, a form that recurs in the Odyssey, the Aeneid, and Dante's Inferno, each subsequent version inheriting structural elements traceable to the Sumerian original. The tablets remain in their cases, in Philadelphia, in London, fragments in Baghdad, in Istanbul, in Berlin. The clay that received their impressions when the cities of Sumer stood at the centre of the known world preserves, still, a vision of existence that encompasses love, ambition, death, compassion, justice, and renewal, rendered with an artistry and insight that continues to compel recognition across the distance of 4 millennia. The Sumerian answer, embedded in these fragile clay artifacts, was neither simple optimism nor despair. It was the recognition that death and life are bound together in a reciprocity that cannot be broken, only endured. The seasons turn, the grain is cut and planted again, the planet Venus disappears below the horizon and reappears on the other side of the sky, the goddess descends and rises, the god dies and returns, not because the universe is kind, but because it is balanced. The colophons on some tablet copies, brief notes recording the scribe's name and the date, reveal that these texts were treated with the seriousness accorded to legal documents. They were curriculum, theology, and constitutional law in a single literary form, and the questions they pose about the price of ambition, the power of compassion, the inescapability of death, and the possibility of return, remain as quietly present as they were when a Sumerian scribe, working in a mud-brick schoolroom, first pressed a reed stylus into wet clay and wrote, "From the great heaven she set her mind on the great below."